David is anointed king of Judah. It's a really good thing I didn't try to cover David's covenant with God. But Saul has one surviving son, Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth, good luck with that name, was a decent man but a weak personality. Abner, Saul's cousin and military commander. Abner's been Saul's military commander from way back when. He's mentioned David and Goliath. He's mentioned ever since Saul first became king. Abner sets Ishbosheth on the throne of Israel and rules through him, commanding the loyalty of the other 11 tribes. The stage is set for civil war. Does David want civil war?
No.
No. Does Ishbosheth want civil war? I don't know. But you know who does want civil war? Abner and Joab. Take a look at the handout of David's brothers and sisters. I didn't get around to doing a family tree for Saul, so just trust me when I say Abner, Saul's cousin. But I really wanted to show you here the sons of Zeruiah. David's got an older sister named Zeruiah. She's listed right here next to David. She's got 3 sons, Abishai, Joab, and Asahel. Joab is going to be one of the main characters in the David story. He's one you got to remember. He is David's general and right-hand man. And he's David's nephew, but again, Zeruiah's got to be his older sister. They're probably close to the same age. Joab, David's nephew and military commander. Not a man you'd want to cross. He's Machiavellian. He's cunning. He's got all of David's bravery and political instincts without his merciful heart. For a couple of chapters here, we get the story of Abner and Joab, 2 schemers who profess to believe in God, who toss off God's name like it's nothing, but are really all about personal power. The Civil War is going David's way the longer it lasts. But one day in battle, Asahel, Joab's brother, runs after Abner, intent on killing him. Saul's general Abner replies, "Don't make me kill you. I do not want Joab mad at me." But Asahel closes in for the kill, so Abner runs him through with the butt of his spear. Saul's general Abner has just killed Joab's brother. Joab will not forget this. In the meantime, Abner makes a bid for the throne of Israel by sleeping with one of Saul's former concubines. In this culture, if you claim the king's woman, you're claiming the throne. Remember this. Unfortunately, it is going to be a major plot point time and time again. Ishbosheth timidly confronts Abner. "Why did you go into my father's concubine?" Abner struts around and blusters at him. "I try to be loyal to Saul's house, and accusations like this are how you repay me? I'm going to give your throne to David." So, Abner, in a flurry of self-righteousness, defects to the stronger side. David meets with Abner, who says he will rally all Israel to David. And as Abner leaves to make good on his promise, Joab pulls Abner aside to speak to him. His hand on his shoulder, draws him close, pulls out the knife, and stabs him deep in the belly. Joab says he killed Abner to avenge the death of his brother. He also did it because Abner's a much more experienced military commander, really respected. Abner joined David, Joab would be out of a job. David is furious at Joab. Abner was going to give them all Israel, and now he's dead. Also, everyone is going to think that David double-crossed Abner and secretly ordered his death. So David, ever the master politician, puts on sackcloth and ashes and orders Joab and the entire court to do the same. David publicly fasts and mourns for Abner and laments him, and probably writes him a song. He gives him a funeral with great honors, and the people believe David's pleas of innocence. And he is actually innocent. Afterwards, though, David quietly complains, "The sons of Zeruiah are too hard for me." David's not going to kill them or get rid of them. He's not going to stoop to their level. But then, he has to live with them. Joab is going to be a drag on David's entire reign. Joab's going to be a constant temptation to abandon the high ideals of mercy, justice, and peace, and play power politics instead. There's a lot of Abners and Joabs in this world. Sometimes they're even us. People who are petty, self-seeking, not centered on God. We can't let ourselves be dragged down to that level. When there are petty fights going on at work, at church, in our families, we need to stand above it all. We want to be peacemakers. We want to be beautiful souls, like Jonathan, like Abigail, and ultimately like David. But in this story, you read this and you go, why is this in the Bible? Why do you have these power-hungry people here? God is working out his purposes, even in this messy, messy world.
She had her maid sleep with Abraham. He fathered Ishmael, and then Hagar and Ishmael were sent off, and that was the Muslim side of the house. So this whole thing has been being set up from the very beginning.
Exactly. And as long as you brought it up, I was going to bring that up next week as an example of why polygamy is a bad idea. But since you brought it up, I'll bring it up now. People have asked in this class, why does God seem to be permitting polygamy at this point in history? All throughout the Old Testament, we see example after example after example of polygamy. It never turns out well. Actually, I want to make that point for the purposes of David's story. God is going to treat polygamy different from adultery in this story. Polygamy, as we see throughout the Old Testament, every single time it pops up, leads to misery. It is not God's way. But adultery is what is proscribed in the Ten Commandments. Adultery is what's going to get David in trouble with God. Not to make an argument for the acceptability of polygamy, it's not, but that this was a cultural practice that God's not particularly going after in this day and age. He's going after adultery. He's going after bigger fish to fry. Oh, you guys didn't want to leave at 8:30, did you? No. All right. After the death of Abner, Ishbosheth, son of Saul, is left ruling Israel, a weak king. Abner was all his strength. Two opportunists cut off the king's head while he's taking his afternoon siesta and proudly presented to David, expecting a reward. They should have known better. Instead, David is appalled. You assassinated a righteous man in his sleep? And David orders the assassins put to death. Now, there are no rivals left. All the tribes of Israel come to David at Hebron. They make a covenant with David and anoint him king. God has fulfilled his promise. David, after 7 years of being king of Judah, is now king over all Israel. He's 37 years old, with 7 wives and 6 official sons. One of the very first things David does is establish his new capital city, Jerusalem. Jerusalem is ideally placed to be the capital city of a united Israel. It's between north and south, same rationale as Washington, D.C., and it's a highly defensible position. There's just one problem. Jerusalem's not an Israelite city. Jerusalem belongs to the Jebusites, one of the Canaanite peoples. One commentary I read referred to it as the coiled snake of the desert. You don't want to attack this city. It's heavily fortified. It's unbeatable by frontal assault. The Jebusites taunt David from the walls of Jerusalem. The blind and the lame could beat you up. David orders his men to climb up the water shaft, saying, let's take on the blind and the lame. They take the Jebusites by surprise, and bam, Jerusalem belongs to Israel. It is hard to overstate the importance of this moment. So, it's over in a paragraph, but so much of the action in the Bible from this point forward is centered in Jerusalem, including most especially the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But Jerusalem, the holy city, starts here with David. Now, David wants to make this a holy city. He wants to bring glory to God. He wants to bring the Ark of the Covenant in to his new capital. The Ark was neglected under King Saul. It's been sitting around in the house of the priest Abinadab, gathering dust for the last 30 years. So, Abinadab's sons, Uzzah and Ahio, load it onto an ox cart to carry it into Jerusalem. But during the procession, the oxen stumble, and it looks like the ark is going to fall off the cart. Uzzah reaches out his hand to steady it, and as his hand touches the ark, bam! Uzzah drops dead. David is terribly afraid and sends the ark away. Why does God kill Uzzah for mishandling the Ark of the Covenant? God looks at the heart. Last week, the priest Ahimelech broke the Levitical law to give David bread. He gave David the holy bread from the altar that only the priests were supposed to eat because David was hungry. Did God strike him dead? No. God was pleased that Ahimelech had mercy on a man in need. God looks at the heart. So what's going on in Uzzah's heart? Well, let's speculate here. Uzzah grew up with the Ark of the Covenant as a piece of furniture in his home. Do you think they kept it in the barn? Do you think they stuffed it in the shed with all the other furniture that wasn't in use? That's what happens in my place. Did they put it in the corner of their dining room? Did they put knickknacks on it and doilies? Do people bump into it all the time? Where has the Ark of the Covenant been for the last 30 years? It's been in his house. They haven't been putting it on a pedestal and bowing down to it every day. Uzzah has lost his sense of the holy. He's lost the respect due to God. He's lost his sense of the holiness of the Ark of the Covenant. He's lost his sense of the holiness of God. As per God's instructions to Moses, the Ark is supposed to be, like you said, carried on 2 poles by Levites, like a royal traveler at the time might be carried in the sedan chair. Instead, Uzzah has the Ark loaded onto an ox cart. What do you carry on an ox cart? Stuff. Things. Idols. That's how the Philistines lugged around the Ark of the Covenant. Look how much good it did them, all the way back in week 1. Uzzah's God fits in a box and needs help with his balance. Uzzah's got a very limited view of God. And in this public procession, Uzzah is debasing God before all the people. And God chooses to make an example of him. Do we have a sense of the holiness of God? Or do we think that wherever our hearts are and whatever we do, God's going to be okay with it? The Apostle Paul says, shall we go on sinning that grace may abound? Certainly not. As Christians, we're constantly called to clean sin out of our lives. What sin are you fighting? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. After this happened, David was scared of God. David went, what went wrong? Do we need to be timid with God? Do we need to be tiptoeing around God for fear of offending him? By no means. David had a lively awareness of the holiness of God. And once David figured out what went wrong, how did David express it? He danced. 3 months after the death of Uzzah, David is ready to try again to bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. And this time, things are done right. There is repentance. There is sacrifice. There are actual Levites who spiritually prepare themselves and bring the Ark out on poles. And as the Ark processes through Jerusalem, David dances exuberantly before the Ark, wearing nothing but a linen ephod, which as far as I can tell seems to cover about as much as a long t-shirt. David needs to express his joy, his sheer, utter joy that God is with him right here, right now, at this very place, at this very time in history. God has kept all his promises. God has given David all these good gifts. David's joy and gratitude are beyond words. David cannot express his thanks for all the goodness that God has done to him. We too can take joy in the Lord. We can bring to mind all that God has done for us in the past. We can name and appreciate all the good gifts he has given us. We can remember to seek his presence in every moment, not just in Jerusalem 3,000 years ago, but right here, right now. But then, David comes home after the party, and he gets a figurative bucket of cold water dumped on his head. He is greeted by his wife, Michal. Michal, daughter of Saul, was David's first wife. But if you were here last week, you'll remember they were forcibly separated by Saul and civil war for probably close on 15 years. Way back then, they were young and in love. Now, life has moved on for both of them. Saul forced Michal to remarry just to spite David. But Michal ended up happy in her second marriage. Her new husband loved her. David has got at least 6 other wives at this point, but David wants Michal back. He wants her back for reasons of political legitimacy. She's the daughter of Saul. David can make a reasonable claim to be Saul's heir, convince all the unconvinced that are still hanging around in Israel, and there's plenty of them. He can convince them that he really is Saul's heir if she's his wife. Also, as you saw with Ishbosheth, in this culture, a king can't give up any of his women. It's like giving up the throne. So, at the end of the Civil War, a couple of years before this, David demanded the return of his first wife, Michal. And poor Michal was dragged away from her second husband while he cried and ran after her. Now, Michal hates David's guts. The two of them will live as husband and wife, but they will never reconcile. Notice the lack of children. David walks in the door, and Michal aims to hurt him. What kind of king do you think you are, flashing your man parts to the whole crowd? My father, he had class. He was dignified. He knew how to be king. David is hurt and angry. God chose me to be king over your father, and I will make merry before the Lord. It is easy to pity Michal. She's got a lot to be better at. But in one crucial way, she's just like her father. She is blind and deaf to the presence of the Lord right in her midst. The Ark of the Covenant comes into Jerusalem. God mounts his throne to shouts of joy. This is a historic occasion. This is a victory celebration for the glory of God. And what's she doing? She is fuming at her husband. Are we joy killers like Michal? Are we consumed with anger or hatred or worry? Or do we enjoy life? Do we enjoy God? Do we relish all the joy that comes our way? And I get to tell you the story of how David became my patron saint, because sadly enough, it kind of ties into all this. Apologies to those of you who have heard this story before. I've told it in previous Monday night classes. Hope you don't mind hearing it again for people here that are new. One Monday night a year and a half ago, I taught a class on Mary and David. Late that night, it was 2 a.m., I woke up and I couldn't get back to sleep. I had the idea in my head that it had been a while since I'd really chatted with a saint, and I should pray to a saint. So I prayed to St. Augustine, brief exchange. Then I prayed to St. Francis Xavier. Nothing. Then, almost without meaning to, I didn't think through the consequences of this. I prayed, King David, pray for me. He was on my mind after the class I just taught. Bam! I felt the presence of David, and I felt joy. Soul-expanding joy. It seemed almost as though David was pouring light and joy into my face, as though from a pitcher. The experience lasted about 2 minutes. Then David spoke. Anytime you need joy, just ask me. What? Anytime I need joy, just ask David? I didn't know what to think. That sounded unbelievable. So I put him to the test. Can you do that again? And he did. Again, the face glowing joy. Again, it lasted about 2 minutes. Again, I said. David laughed. And suddenly, in the midst of all that joy, I was terrified. I realized that David's invitation to continue asking him for joy implied some kind of long-term patron-saint relationship. I wasn't ready to make the commitment. David is not safe. David is scary. Wasn't he that guy in the Bible that committed murder and adultery? What was I supposed to learn from him? Couldn't I have, like, Saint Therese of Lisieux? And so I started making my excuses to David. Look, You and I, we have nothing in common. I began listing off all the differences between us that I could think of, and I managed to end on, and I've only been married once. Ouch. David got angry. And I sensed something from him along the lines of, oh, you have no idea. Then his anger was gone. And he said, oh, don't worry. You'll learn from me. And then he was gone. Then I was really terrified. I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. But the next day, I remembered it was the beginning of Lent. And a few days ago, I had asked God this Lent to teach me mercy, generosity, compassion, and open-hearted living. And I realized David was probably God's answer to my prayer. So, while I was driving to church that evening, I made a formal apology to David. I asked him if he could forgive me, and if he would be my patron saint this Lent, and if he would teach me all those good things I'd asked for, the mercy and the compassion and the generosity. I told him I was ready to learn anything he wanted to teach me. And just then, my car came to a stop sign. There was only one other car on the road, the car right in front of me, and its license plate read, joy-filled. I took that as a yes. I can't possibly summarize all of the good, crazy things that happened next. For 3 months, everywhere I went, I saw the verse, do not judge lest you be judged. But David didn't just correct me, although he did plenty of that. He gave me gifts. He gave me sandals that healed my feet. That's a story in and of itself. He gave me chocolates that healed my friend's marriage. Another crazy story. And once he made a white frilly hat appear at my feet so that I could give it to an Egyptian refugee as an Easter gift. He's got panache. And all kinds of crazy parallels to David's story started opening up in my own life. David went on to teach me an awful lot about mercy, generosity, courage, and joy. And guess what? I'm still learning. I hope you find your own ways to relate David's story to your life.